Hello and welcome back. We have now moved on to step 3 of provisioning an EC2 instance in where we need to configure some instance details. So in this lesson, I'm primarily going to focus on IP addressing, the difference between public and private IP addresses. But first, I just want to kind of touch on some of the other options that we have to configure here in this section. The first option you'll see here is a number of instances. So we can choose to provision 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 20 instances all at the same time by just adjusting this number here. And of course, all those instances would be launched with the same AMI instance type and any other settings that we select throughout the course of creating this EC2 instance. Next, let's look at network and subnet. This is where you're going to decide which VPC that you want to launch your EC2 instance in. So here I have two options. I have the default VPC and then also the VPC that we created during the live lab in the previous section. So going forward, I'm going to use the live lab VPC as the one that I'm going to provision this EC2 instance into, so that we can go back and reference that diagram that I used during that lab to kind of tie everything together at the end. Next, we need to choose the subnet. Now, if you remember during the lab, we created 4 subnets. We created 2 public and 2 private subnets using 2 availability zones. So depending on which subnet I choose, where you see here subnet 2, subnet 3, subnet 4, and subnet 1, that will also determine what availability zone I'm going to be placing the EC2 instance in. For this particular instance, I want to launch it in lab subnet 1 being my public subnet, which is in the availability zone US East 1A. Okay, next let's get into public IP addresses, or also private IP addresses, and how these are both chosen and work together based on the subnet setting. So over here on the Orion papers, let's click on IP addressing and let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So when we provision an EC2 instance, we have to understand the 2 types of IP addresses that we can have. First is a private IP address. Now, all EC2 instances are automatically created with a private IP address. We can't choose to not have a private IP address. It's going to come with one by default. Now, the private IP address is used for internal, meaning inside of the VPC, communication between instances. So a private IP address cannot be accessed by something outside of the VPC. You can only access an instance through its private IP address from another instance within the VPC. Next is a public IP address. And when creating an EC2 instance, you have the option to enable or auto-assign a public IP address. A public IP address is required, again, if you want the EC2 instance to have a direct communication with resources across the open internet. So i.e., if you want to directly SSH into an instance or have it directly serving web traffic. Also, auto-assigning is based on the settings for the selected subnet that you are provisioning the instance in. So what does this mean exactly? So if we look here under auto-assign IP address, it's going to give us 3 options. One is going to be enable. So if we know that we definitely want this EC2 instance to have a public IP address, we can just select enable. If we don't want it to have a public IP address, we can just select disable. But there's always going to be an auto setting, and that's going to be based on the subnet. Now here it is currently set as disabled. Now how is this managed? So let's go back and let's take a look at our subnet. So in another tab, let me go back to the main part of the console. I'll go to the VPC section. I'm going to click on subnets, and we know that we are going to launch this into lab subnet 1, which is a public subnet, but let's click on it, and now let's look under auto assign public IP, and it says no. Now, if I wanted to change this, if I want to change this from auto assign public IP from no to yes, I just need to go up to actions here, make sure the proper subnet is selected, go to actions, and go to modify auto assign IP addresses. So then I can click on here, enable auto assign public IPv4 addresses, and click save. So now if I refresh the subnet, we will see now that for this public subnet in availability zone US East 1, the auto-assign public IP is now set to enable. It just switched over for us. So now that instead of that being disabled, it is now enabled by default. So anytime that I'm going to provision an EC2 instance into this subnet, what's going to happen is it's automatically going to provision a public IP address for me unless I specifically now come down here and select disabled. Now, if I go back over to the subnet and I go back to actions, modify auto assign IP, uncheck that, save it again, close it, come back over here, refresh the VPC, it is now going to say disabled here. So we see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to talk about elastic IP addresses in a second, but let's just go through some of these other settings so that we have a good understanding of what they are. Now, we did go over this during the IAM section of this course, but this is where you can select and set the IAM role for your EC2 instance. We can then also select shutdown behavior. And this is what's going to occur when you actually shut down the instance from inside the instance, meaning that you turn off the operating system. If you were to shut down the machine at the command prompt, would it just stop the machine or would it actually terminate the machine? That means if you were to have an on-demand instance, it would terminate it and it would no longer be available for you to use in your account. If you were to just have it to stop, then you could shut down the instance and then start it again whenever you like. You can also enable termination protection, and that means that this instance will not be able to be terminated through the API or through the AWS management console until this protection is physically turned off. So if you're worried about an EC2 instance being accidentally terminated, you can use this as an option, and you can also set up something like multi-factor authentication as a protection against accidental deletion. Then there's monitoring. You can enable CloudWatch detailed monitoring. We're going to go into what that means later on in this course when we go into our CloudWatch section. And then also tenancy, and this was something that we covered briefly during the introduction to VPC section, but this is where you can either use shared hardware, which if you remember I talked about in the previous lesson when we talked about virtualization, or if you wanted to run it on a dedicated host, but that does come at an increased cost as it says here. Okay, so next let's talk about elastic IP addresses. Now, elastic IP addresses is a static IPv4 address designed for dynamic cloud computing. Now, it's important to understand that elastic IP addresses are public IP addresses. So with an elastic IP address, you can attach a public IP address to an EC2 instance that was created with only a private IP address, or you can mask the failure of an instance or software by rapidly remapping the address to another instance in your account, i.e. meaning that you can detach the elastic IP address from one instance and attach it to another. Also, it's important to understand that attaching an elastic IP to an instance will replace its default public IP address for as long as it is attached. So you can attach an elastic IP address to an instance that has a public IP address or doesn't already have a public IP address, but it is a way that you can have a static IP address and move that IP address from instance to instance. So this is important if you have an application that has an IP address hard-coded into it, right? So if the application is pointing to a specific IP address and that instance were to fail, you wouldn't want to have to recode and redeploy the application software. All you would need to do was take that elastic IP address and just attach it to a new instance running the software, and there would be a seamless transition from one instance to the other with the application still pointing to the same IP address. So let's take a look at where that's handled, because those are actually created back out here in the VPC dashboard under elastic IP addresses, or they can also be managed under EC2, also under elastic IPs. They both bring up the same section. So what we can do here is we can click on allocate a new address, click on allocate, and there we go. It has now allocated this IP address for us, and this is going to be our elastic IP address, and we can view that here. Now, I can take this and I can attach this to any instance that I create, and we're going to do this a little bit later once we actually finish provisioning our EC2 instance, but I just kind of wanted you to be aware of what all of these different types of IP addresses are and how they are used. So back to our instance. Here, even though we still have this as disabled for US East 1 subnet, I do want to just switch this to enable because I do want this EC2 instance to be provisioned with a public IP address. So with that, we will conclude this lesson on IP addresses. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.